Welcome to the History of Ideas Club, Revolutions 4, the English Civil War, hosted by me, Samuel Woodall. This theoretically will be the last of our online formats, but we'll wait and see, obviously, in terms of practicalities. But ideally, the next one will be back in person. Who are behind me? Well, we've got Oliver Cromwell and we've got King Charles I. And one of them will... he started the day. I can't remember what the sort of idiom is. It's like he started the day 6'2" and ended the day 5'8" or something like that. But that's in jest, so we shall get to that. But this is on the English Civil War. I know a couple of you may have missed, including Jack, in fact, missed last week's session, the build-up of Protestantism. Stephanie, you will have done as well, but it will be available to watch on YouTube very soon, or to listen to on whatever podcasting platform you desire. And we built up through Protestantism across Europe, and then focused in on Protestantism in England. And we went through the Lollards, Oldcastle's rebellion, and then we led up to, obviously, Henry VIII, the split from Rome. We built up through the Stuarts, mentioned James VI, no bishop, no king, his response to Presbyterianism, so James VI and first. And we ended with Charles I and this figure of Cromwell in the famous Richard Harris depiction, saying, away with this popish idolatry. And this was to foreshadow what was to come. But to set some context, we'll go back into the Stuart era to build up to the English Civil War, or what I should have put maybe in brackets is Civil War wars in brackets. So framing the conflict, authority and the human person, well, the English Civil War wars were not only military or constitutional struggles, but an intellectual conflict over human nature and political order. From the 16th century onward, growing parliamentary involvement in governance sharpened disagreements about freedom, authority, and self-government. Monarchical assumptions held that humans were passionate and unequal, requiring firm hierarchy. Authority flows downward from God to king, and freedom meant security under stable rule. Parliamentary and republican arguments increasingly treated humans as moral agents capable of reasoned consent. Authority was delegated, and freedom meant participation and accountability. These rival anthropologies crystallised during 1642 to 1651, most visibly at moments such as the Putney debates, which is pictured there on the right, where it says, in this place, Oliver Cromwell, the General Council of the Army and elected soldiers of the regiments held the Putney debates, the first recorded public discussion of democratic principles, on the 28th of October and 9th of November 1647, presented by the Cromwell Association, November 1982. Adara, I don't know if you would have seen that ever, being in and around Putney?
Not anything I can remember, no.
No, interesting.
Well, it might still be around. I don't really pay much attention to it.
I think it's at a church in Putney, but I'm not sure exactly which one.
Well, there's only the one, which is the one by the Putney Bridge.
Oh, it must be there.
Yeah. Or it could be in Bishop Park, in fairness. But
right. Oh, yeah, we'll have to investigate. But an unprecedented explosion of print culture was also happening in the 1640s that only continues to thrive into the interregnum, as the period of Cromwell's rule is called, which spread political ideas far beyond elites, intensifying ideological conflict. By the regicide of 1649, the core question was unavoidable: is political order best secured by inherited authority or by consent and participation? And as usual, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them either in the chat or
just to go back on the Putney debates thing, Sam.
Yes,
I think I do recommend something that Cromwell had in a public toilet, or what was eventually a public toilet in Putney. So it might be associated with that, yeah.
And Stephanie, you're down that way in Fulham, if I remember correctly, or sort of in that direction, Chiswick way. So you might be able to investigate it. Yeah, you might be able to investigate it.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe not the public toilet, though.
No, that's where I think it was held.
Okay.
Where it was then held, eventually did become a public toilet, which is quite fun.
Oh, very interesting. And what does that? Yeah, is that a foreshadowing of things to come? Let's see. So What were the immediate precursors to the civil wars? Well, by the late 1630s, the English state was under severe fiscal strain, driven by the costs of war and the Crown's limited capacity to raise revenue without Parliament. Charles I's resort to extra parliamentary finance, and this is something that I've written about, most notably ship money, deepened suspicion that royal prerogative was being stretched beyond accepted constitutional bounds. Also, simultaneously, the chap that I write about for my PhD, Paul de Rapin, Rapin de Toiris, he critiques Charles I's power of patronage, that lots of dukes and earls who were the king's favourites were being given massive stipends in modern language, probably in the hundreds of thousands, as the public purse was completely spent. And this only intensified irritation at the time, but also in the Whig canon moving forward into the sort of into the late 17th century and 18th century, looking back at the Stuart rule. And this deepened suspicion that royal prerogative was being stretched beyond accepted constitutional bounds. Trust between Crown and Parliament steadily eroded during the personal rule 1629 to 1640, as governance without Parliament came to be seen as a threat to political liberty rather than a temporary expedient. You've got to remember as well that there were rumours that the Stuarts were secret Catholics, so this idea that, as Jack and I have discussed before, that England will be returned to the bondage of Pharaoh, as all of these kind of later Whigs would call it, because of the Stuarts coming from the bloodline of Mary Queen of Scots. Religious reform without consensus, particularly the drive for uniformity in worship, intensified political anxieties by appearing to align religious authority with arbitrary power. Structurally, England faced a growing mismatch between a monarch committed to prerogative rule and a parliament increasingly conscious of its representative legitimacy and historic rights. When Parliament reassembled in 1640, disputes were no longer about personalities or policy details, but about where sovereignty ultimately resided. By the early 1640s, the conflict had become constitutional in nature, a struggle over authority, consent, and the limits of power, making armed confrontation increasingly likely rather than accidental. Any questions, as I say, please feel free, pop them in the chat or put your hand up, interject, perfectly happy. Nothing, Jack, in terms of any thoughts or anything so far?
I can add a little bit of context. We were just mentioning this very briefly, and I found this quite interesting myself, because Parliament, you mentioned Parliament becoming conscious of its own important role to play, its own sovereignty, relatively speaking, from the Crown and its historic rights, and you can sort of trace that back more or less to the Tudor period, particularly because you have a few parallel developments. Also, I mean, you can trace the conflict back to the Tudor period, particularly. So you have the centralisation of power in the monarch, really from Henry VII onward. How did this happen? Well, because the nobles are dying in the wars of the Roses, so there's not many counterposing noble families anymore. I think maybe you go back to Richard III as well for that. In 1533, I think Henry creates his own Privy Council, which is just people he selects. So it's no longer the hereditary titles with some people from distinct institutions like the church or different families. It's just the people he chooses. At the same time, you're getting landed people, given land by the Crown, given a bit of independence there. They're not hereditary titles necessarily, or they're not the same hereditary title that have gone before. They're new, but that sort of sets up the Crown and country conflict. What interested me most was that Parliament becomes increasingly the arm of the Crown to get national consent for radical religious reform. So it's like, from the Crown's perspective, it's symbolic of the nation's assent to these radical changes. It's not necessarily representative of that, because obviously there's a lot of coercion. But anyway, I just saw that with some points that are worth mentioning, maybe. Just to situate that they had a long history of at least 100 years.
You would know more about Thucydides than me, Jack, but when you look at the scholarship on what causes civil war, Thucydides discusses like stasis and civil strife as a cause for civil war. Can you see? I mean, I don't know again how well versed you are, but I'm sure you've covered him. Can you see those kind of ideas falling into play when we look at this from an intellectual, historical kind of lens?
Sure. Sorry, that was Thucydides said what about civil war?
That it kind of comes from stasis. That sort
Stasis.
of the tensions between fear, honor, political interests, these sort of things are the sort of root cause of civil wars across the board.
I don't remember such a general comment, but he gives you in the Peloponnesian Wars. I mean, it's possibly there, but he gives you a summary of the quite a detailed summary of all the events that led to this conflict. And there is immense reluctance on the part of the Spartans to actually engage with the fact at hand that the Athenians are clearly coming to dominate. They're taking advantage of the post-Persian War vacuum, and they're extending what was supposed to just be a neutral agreements among trading islands and nations. It's now become de facto the Athenian Empire. Stasis, I wouldn't know how exactly to interpret stasis in that context. I guess maybe the friction where you've got these treaties that clearly are not being adhered to anymore, but no one quite has the courage to drive forward. That kind of thing, maybe. The sort of, we know that if we take the action necessary, this is going to have serious consequences. We're going to be at war for a long time. It's going to be costly. Are we ready to take that step? But people feel like they have no other choice.
And obviously, we just recorded an episode of the podcast which we're trying to catch up on De Maistre, and I suppose he would say that it's sort of a divine punishment for sort of revolutionary spirit or something like that when it comes to discussing a civil war rather than maybe an international war.
Oh, it's possible. I don't know what he would say about that, because it's not obvious to me that in Maistre's view, revolutionary wars are intrinsically evil.
But it's something interesting. Something interesting to keep in mind for everyone is what are people's opinions on. And I'd love to hear sort of at some point what people think about what causes civil wars across the board. And we obviously live in a very a time where politics is becoming very polarized. And civil war is something more and more discussed, whether it be in America, whether it be in Russia, who knows, after the political tumult of the last week or two in England. who knows? We could add to the civil wars plural, but keep it in mind, and if anyone has any thoughts, then please do from what they've read before. We'll move to the next slide. So the first English Civil War, 1642 to 1646. The First English Civil War was fundamentally a conflict over sovereignty, where ultimate political authority lay, and this is sort of what Jack was precursoring there in terms of the developments of sort of the British state in essence. Royalists defended the king's inherited authority and prerogative, while parliamentarians claimed a right to resist in defence of the kingdom and its liberties. Early fighting reflected regional loyalties, local grievances, and the mobilisation of county militias rather than a fully national war. As the conflict progressed, Parliament gained advantage through the gradual professionalisation of its forces, most decisively with the creation of the new model army in 1645. Military success increasingly rested on discipline, organisation and ideological commitment, rather than traditional aristocratic leadership. There is a period much further back in England called the Anarchy, which is sort of described as a civil war in England if you go back to the 1300s, but obviously in a feudal time, very much led by aristocratic elements across society. But this is much more ideological, at least for some historians. By 1646, the king was militarily defeated, but the war had resolved none of the underlying constitutional questions. Parliamentarians weren't wholeheartedly committed, for example, to the abolition of kingship. This wasn't really something that was even on their minds at this point, apart from in the most radical of circles. The outcome produced political uncertainty rather than settlement, leaving unresolved the problem of how authority could be exercised without returning to unchecked monarchy. Anything to add if anyone has any thoughts or comments, or Jack, if you have any deliberations?
No, but it's interesting. I didn't know that the overthrow of the king was a minor view within the parliamentarians.
At this time, certainly not. Certainly, the kind of parliamentarian forces are led by noblemen with ideological convictions to the sovereignty and the power of Parliament. But certainly not certainly when we're coming to what eventually happens, there's no question of this final end result, which will ultimately be a regicide.
So is this Cromwell's design from the beginning, or is this something he gradually realizes as the war goes on?
Earlier on, Cromwell is a relatively insignificant force. He's not leading.
Oh, really?
He's leading in the sense of kind of he's like a general, and there's various politicians who take up the reins of kind of political authority at this point in terms of directing what the parliamentarians will do as a fighting force. So imagine like a president or prime minister in a big conflict. Yes, they're the ones making the policy decisions. Cromwell is the one essentially in charge of the military force. It would be easier to say at this point.
I see. Oh, it's very interesting.
Let's move on. We have an excerpt here from Charles I in 1646, so at the conclusion of that first civil war. Now, as for your advice to me, you speak my very soul in everything but one, that is the church. Remember your own rule, not to expect to redeem that which is given away by act of parliament. Shall I then give away the church? And excuse me to tell you that I believe you do not understand what this is, that you are content, I confess not upon very easy terms, I should give away. I will begin to show you first what is in point of policy, and first negatively. It is not the change of church government which is chiefly aimed at, though that were too much, but it is by that pretext to take away the dependency of the church from the crown, which, let me tell you, I hold to be of equal consequence to that of the militia, for people are governed by the pulpit more than the sword in times of peace. Nor will the Scots be content with the alteration of government, except the covenant be likewise established, the which does not only make good all their former rebellions, but likewise lays a firm and fruitful foundation for such pastimes in all times to come. Now, for the theological part, I assure you the change would be no less and worse than if popery were brought in, for we should have neither lawful priests nor sacraments duly administered, nor God publicly served, but according to the foolish fancy of every idle person. But we should have the doctrine against kings fiercer set up than amongst the Jesuits. In a word, set your hearts at rest. I will less yield to this than the militia, my conscience being irreconcilably engaged against it. Wherefore I conjure you as Christians to assist me, particularly in this also. Yet I say not that the Scots are to be shaken off, but to be sought with all possible industry, usque ad aras. Nor do I mislike your fancy concerning the Prince of Wales treating with the independents, wherein I give you full liberty, according to your own cautions, to try your fortunes, though I believe it will not hit. So what do we see here in what Charles is saying to his interlocutors that he's writing to? He's making it clear he's under pressure from both the Scots and the English Parliament to accept the terms for settlement they were proposing to end that first civil war. But he says he's not going to, he's not going to give too much in this. Jack, on the theological, maybe?
Yeah, it's quite a dense text. I've never read Charles before. I'm just going through. So he gives us two reasons why he's sort of resistant. It's not the change of church government which is chiefly aimed at, but it is by that pretext to take away the dependency of the church from the crown, which I hold to be an equal consequence to that of the militia, for people are governed by the pulpit more than swords of time and peace. So he wants to keep the church under the crown because he sees that instrumental to governance.
Yeah.
But the concession will involve the giving the church autonomy.
Yep.
Okay. And the Scots the Scots would not be content with the alteration of government except the covenant be likewise established. I don't know what that means.
So obviously they're Presbyterians. They're looking for a more radical settlement in terms of the makeup of the church, which obviously becomes Church of Scotland alongside the Church of England, but doing away with hierarchy within the church.
Okay, and then the theological part you asked about. Now for the theological part, I assure you the change would be no less, so this is referring to the change of giving the church independence from this crown, which should be no less and worse than if popery were brought in, for we should have neither lawful priest nor sacraments duly administered, nor God publicly served, but according to the foolish fancy of every idle person, we should have the doctrine against kings. This is a very interesting statement. So the lawful priests or sacraments duly administered is a reference to the ecclesial hierarchy. So in Catholicism, there has to be the ordination of priests by bishops, and so there's a succession, and through the lawful ordination comes the lawful power of priests to administer sacraments, including confession, marriage, ordination, Holy Eucharist, all these things. Now, the thing is, the whole drama of Henry's divorce from the Catholic Church is that this sets the stage for what do you call it, the severing of the ecclesial line, which is formalized by his son Edward. So the Church of England never did have a lawful succession. So this is this is in reference to a succession which Charles believes to come sort of purely from the authority of the crown, I presume, because the crown at this time must have some oversight in the appointment of bishops. Is that correct?
Yes, completely.
So in some sense, he reduces the church's power to the regal authority. The sacramental efficacy to the regal authority, which is highly controversial.
No, you get to a point. Essentially, he's saying my conscience is the final court of appeal. So I think when we look at the core meaning of this letter, number one, he is willing to concede sort of tacitly, but not fundamentally, right? He's signalling a willingness to appear flexible on the church, on Parliament, on settlement terms, but he is essentially insisting on preserving the essence of kingship. This actually comes back to something Dara raised in the last session on the divine right of kings, that ultimately this isn't stubbornness, but it's a political theology that has run through to this time, right? That even when he authorizes negotiation, he insists that nothing may violate his understanding of divine kingship. But he's also thinking in the back of his mind, this is a desperate situation that England is in, barely ever seen before. We have rebellions. I said there was the anarchy, but in terms of political strife, he's thinking, well, this hasn't happened before. I don't know what's going to happen next. Delay is my greatest weapon. So Charles believes time will fracture his enemies. He assumes Parliament, the Scots, Presbyterians, and Independents cannot remain long united, considering they're very different political and religious forces that have all come together out of a sense of discontent at the time, but ultimately are very different in their political and religious makeup. Who are the people he is writing to? Well, Lord Jermyn is a diplomat. He's in France. He's pragmatic. He's open to compromise. But from his vantage point across the seas, he can see that this is a desperate situation the king's in. And prior to this, he has been pressing Charles to make concessions to save the monarchy, right? So Charles is clearly not going to be particularly kind of happy in letters that he's receiving from Lord Jermyn, because he's being told that he should divide up some of his authority and power over the political and the religious.
That's fascinating letter, and I think it does definitively show that Charles is not a Catholic.
But neither would James, his father, have said that he was a Catholic. But there's this idea that, ultimately the universal church, the mother church, is the one that one day they long to return to. They wouldn't say that they're popish, but they would say that, in their hearts, the universal church is the one that they would love to still be reunited with.
I see. So when Charles here references would be no less and worse than if popery were brought in, is that a political judgment or a personal judgment? in your
I would say a
estimation?
political one. It's one
I
to try
see.
and
Okay.
yeah,
Okay. Okay.
yeah.
I see. But he doesn't understand the sacramental principle, which is interesting.
And obviously
Or
he wouldn't want to have his the point he's making is he wouldn't want to have his political power. We've discussed this before. When you look at people like Cardinal Bellarmine and the discussion of temporal and secular power, temporal and spiritual power, which is that obviously the great debate that happened during the emergence of Protestantism was how far do secular rulers have authority. Now, the Church of England is very unique in the sense that it places divine authority also in the hands of a secular king. But the Pope could be a limit on political authority, which for Charles would more be the reason why he's raising popery. That, look, Englishmen, if you're worried about my political power limiting your freedom, well, bloody hell, don't let some foreign court, as far as Englishmen are concerned at this time, decide your fate, sort of thing. But I think we can move to the Second Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
So the Second English Civil War, 1648 to 1649. The Second English Civil War marked a decisive escalation of the political crisis rather than a continuation of the First War. Renewed fighting followed a series of negotiations, which convinced many parliamentarians and army leaders that the king was acting in bad faith. Inauthentically, he wasn't speaking truth. These things that Jack and I have just discussed were all a ploy to try and maintain his authority. Royalist risings and the king's continued appeals to external support transformed the conflict from one seeking restoration and settlement into a struggle over principle and legitimacy. And you see, in the Richard Harris depiction, which I would really highly recommend to everyone and anyone. It's one of the best films I've watched in a really long time, the Richard Harris depiction of Cromwell. And you have the chap who plays Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars.
Ah, yes.
Playing
Ewan
Charles.
McGregor.
No, not in the later ones, in the earlier ones, the old man.
No, the original.
Playing Charles I. And you see, for example, Timothy Dalton, a massive actor of his day, playing this continental royalist leader. So elements of continental Europe are being brought over in support of maintaining the monarchy of England, to try and maintain the status quo. And Timothy Dalton plays this, sort of young, passionate leader of the royalist forces. It's a fantastic depiction of this period, even if biased in some ways. But the renewed fighting followed a series of negotiations which convinced many parliamentarians and army leaders that the king was acting in this bad faith. Royalist risings and the king's continued appeal to external support transformed the conflict from one seeking restoration and settlement into a struggle over principle and legitimacy. The war thus became ideological rather than restorative, no longer about reforming monarchy, but about whether monarchy itself could be trusted. This shift empowered more radical elements within the army and parliament, who now framed resistance as a matter of justice rather than necessity. And we discussed briefly resistance theory in the last episode, the idea that with the coming of the Reformation, the idea of political resistance theory also developed, because if you're going to fracture and try and justify your grounds for theological and for your engagement with the transcendent, if you're going to try and defend that and stop a larger and more well-established religious authority from persecuting you, then simultaneously political orders also tried to justify what is it to resist if I am expressing myself in more temporal or secular discussions. So if I don't like the current government, or if I don't like what someone is saying in the public forum, how do I resist if I want to express opinion, but then I'm told you're wrong and we're going to persecute you for it? So political resistance theory develops simultaneously with religious resistance theory. So the conflict culminated in the trial and execution of Charles I in January 1649. As I said earlier, he started the day at 5'8". He started the day at 6'2", ended at 5'8". But the regicide represented the end of sacral monarchy in England, establishing the unprecedented claim that a king could be held politically and morally accountable by his subjects. Of course, as we know, that's not entirely true only on a domestic sphere, but when it comes to the precursor era to the English Reformation, of course, there was an authority that could hold the king accountable. And who was that, Jack?
I'm sorry, that must have been the church, presumably.
Exactly. So obviously the parliamentarians thought they were holding the king to account, and maybe they missed out the point that perhaps the Pope had served as a way of holding secular rulers to account. But this sort of precursors modern kind of international political discussions, really, in terms of that debate. But this was the end of sacred monarchy with the execution, and I thought it was just that we should hear from the man himself at his time of death. So Charles I's speech on the scaffold, given outside the banqueting hall in Whitehall, 30th of January 1649. For the king, the laws of the land will clearly instruct you for that. Therefore, because it concerns my own particular, I only give you a touch of it. For the people, and truly I desire their liberty and freedom as much as anybody whomsoever. But I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having of government those laws by which their life and their goods may be most their own. It is not for having share in government, sir. That is nothing pertaining to them. A subject and a sovereign are clear different things, and therefore until they do that, I mean that you do put the people in that liberty as I say, certainly they will never enjoy themselves. Sirs, it was for this now I am come here. If I would have given way to an arbitrary way, for to have all laws changed according to the power of the sword, I needed not to have come here. And therefore I tell you, and I pray God, it be not laid to your charge, that I am the martyr of the people. In truth, sirs, I shall not hold you much longer, for I will only say this to you, that in truth I could have desired some little time longer, because I would have put this, that I have said in a little more order and a little better digested than I have done. And therefore I hope that you will excuse me. I have delivered my conscience. I pray God that you do take those courses that are best for the good of the kingdom and your own salvation. The Jackson, the justice. Will your majesty, though it may be very well known your majesty's affections to religion, yet it may be expected that you should. I've cut it off. I've cut off the bottom. I can't see the last line.
Something about the world's satisfaction in that particular.
In that particular.
Yeah. You should say somewhat. You should say somewhat for the
It's continued though. We get the gist.
Okay.
I thank you very heartily, my lord, that I had almost forgotten it. In truth, sirs, my conscience in religion, I think, is very well known to the world, and therefore I declare before you all that I die a Christian, according to the profession of the Church of England, as I found it left by my father. And this honest man, the justice, I think will witness it. Addressing the officers on the scaffold. Sirs, excuse me for this same. I have a good cause, and I have a gracious God. I will say no more. Makes himself ready for execution. I have a good cause, and a gracious God on my side. There is but one stage more. The stage is turbulent and troublesome. It is a short one, but you may consider it will soon carry you a very great way. It will carry you from earth to heaven, and there you shall find a great deal of cordial joy and comfort. I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world. You are exchanged from a temporal to an external crown. A good exchange.
Wow.
I know, it's quite amazing, isn't it? Because obviously this taking place outside Parliament meant that it was all recorded.
I didn't know it was recorded in this detail. I'd heard the line. There's a film which has quite a famous depiction of his execution, and the line is reduced to "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible world." In that film. Wow, that's very interesting.
Well, even on that point, Jack, what do you think the difference is there between a world and a crown? You know,
yeah, indeed, it's an interesting choice. I think they've already put some thought into it. Crown is the language of the kingdom of heaven. World is more open. It's almost it's almost that you expect that there's something in his his earthly vocation as King of England, which carries through into heaven.
Mm.
Oh, also I get. Oh, well, no, maybe it's also. It could be something. Here's another take on it. It's something about the crown of martyrs, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
He receives the crown of thorns. He receives the. Yeah, I think that's probably more accurate actually.
He claims.
I don't think he's so prideful to assume he's having some kind of. No, I think he's allying himself with
but
Christ.
yeah, but obviously inherited from, in terms of the divine right of kings. You know, there is an element there, and I think what you're getting at is that he is claiming a certain moral victory and defeat at this point.
Well, indeed, yeah. Well, indeed, a moral victory. Can we go back to the previous slide? I'd
Of
like to
course.
read again what he had to say about liberty and freedom. I found that very interesting. The people and I truly desire their liberty and freedom as much as anybody, but their liberty and freedom consist in having of government those laws by which their life and their goods may be most their own. It is not for having a share in government that is nothing pertaining to them. A subject and sovereign are different things.
That's the line. That is
Yeah.
the quintessential line. I think.
Yes,
A
yes.
subject and a sovereign are clear different things.
And that's supposed to guarantee liberty and freedom.
Exactly. That liberty does not mean participation in sovereignty.
Yeah.
Liberty means security of property and law. These things that will be reiterated by Locke in the preceding decades. Not political power in and of itself, and particularly not that idea of almost participating directly in kingship, in ultimate authority over a certain regime. Right. Parliament has confused liberty with license, the ability to go and freely talk and do as one wishes.
Yes.
And he sort of repeat. Yeah. No, please, Jack.
Well, it's sort of there's a fundamental conservative principle at play there. So so long as the laws are unchanging and they're protected, that's true liberty, that's true freedom. Edmund Burke iterates a version of this in the Reflection on the Revolution in France. I don't know what Burke actually thought about this particular episode in English history.
I mean, by that point, Stuarts are mainly quite out of fashion because obviously it's relatively recent history, but also, you know, unless you're, again, you've heard these terms over and over again, Jack, over the past month, but unless you're a high-flying Tory, unless you're someone really radically, I'm sorry, this sounds so anachronistic, but really radically right in the Tory party at that time, you wouldn't even engage really with sort of Stuart anything about Stuart legacy because that day is gone, sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think the earliest sort of thing that Burke tends to reference is just the Glorious Revolution, or sort of the beginning of English, beginning of English history.
Completely. And we haven't got a session necessarily on the Glorious Revolution, have we? Which is maybe a bit of an oversight, but we can maybe integrate it into something else, or I can mention it at the end of this session. Quickly.
We'll see how much time we have.
But let us press onward because we've only got to the execution of the king so far. We haven't got to the interregnum. So, what are the religious defines of the civil wars? Well, there are religious conflicts during the civil wars that reflect a deep disagreement about authority, order, and obedience, rather than theology alone. The central fault lines lay between episcopacy, Presbyterianism, and this term that came up earlier, the independence or independency, each implying a different model of governance and discipline within the church itself. Many parliamentarians associated episcopal hierarchy with political absolutism, whilst these fears of Catholicism were bound up with anxieties about foreign influence, tyranny, and arbitrary power, all linking back to the Stuart line. Attempts at religious reform without broad consensus heightened tensions as change in worship and church governance were experienced as exercises of coercive authority. This is this famous scene in the Cromwell film where he comes into the church and realizes that Charles has brought back having sort of ornate golden crosses and as Cromwell calls them in the film, baubles. Who brought these baubles to this place? And that's how we ended the last session with his famous utteration where he's like, away with this popish idolatry, and slams all of these beautiful golden crucifixes, etc., off of the church table. Attempts at religious reform without broad consensus heightened tensions, as changes in worship and church governance were experienced as exercises of coercive authority. Religion then functioned as a form of political language. Debates about bishops, synods, and congregations mirrored debates about kings, parliaments, and the people. The question of who governed the church became inseparable from the question of who governed the state, making compromise increasingly difficult. This raises a central interpretive problem for the period. Was religious disagreement a genuine cause of the civil wars, or the idiom through which political conflict was perhaps most powerfully expressed? Jack, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that last question.
Yeah, it does seem to me that the religious is by this point somewhat accidental. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a genuine cause of the civil wars, because it's not really. It's about in my reading, I'm not a historian, but from what you're presenting, it seems to me more that the dispute is about, as you say, anthropology, and about authority versus autonomy. And it seemed that the churches will become factions of different versions of this. Will be used. Charles will use it in one way to defend his position. Cromwell might use it in another way. When you put it there, religion functions as a form of political language. It seems to be very similar. Because then you're going to see, I think, in the Church of England and in the sects of the church that break off from them, the same debate. Should there be an ecclesial hierarchy?
That's very good, Jack. You're precursoring this very nicely. So let's move on to the next slide. You're the man for the segues today. So the political divides of the Civil Wars. Well, the Civil Wars exposed competing visions of political order rather than a simple clash of personalities or interests, at least for some. Absolute monarchy defended the indivisibility of sovereignty, locating authority entirely in the king and treating parliament as advisory. Advocates of a mixed constitution sought to preserve monarchy while insisting on meaningful limits, balancing king, lords, and commons. More radical voices advanced arguments for popular sovereignty, claiming that political authority ultimately derived from the people themselves. The core dispute concerned Parliament's status. Was it merely a council to the king, or a co-sovereign body with independent authority? As the wars progressed, resistance was increasingly justified not as rebellion, but as defence of the political community, the polis. From this emerged a powerful and enduring idea. Rulers themselves are accountable to those that they govern, and authority may be withdrawn if it is abused. And funnily enough, this will then happen with the Cromwellian regime, as we shall see. Jack, any quick thoughts? But what you did was a beautiful segue into the next slide.
Yeah, no, please proceed.
Excellent. Radical political and religious movements. So this is what Jack was saying about fracturing and these different elements of religion intertwined with politics going off in their separate ways. So the upheavals of the English civil wars created political space beyond both Crown and Parliament, allowing new and often radical visions of authority to emerge. You had the Levellers from 1645 to 1649, who argued for popular sovereignty, legal equality, and an extended male franchise. Their ideas reached a mass audience through prolific pamphleteering and debates within the new model army, the military that Cromwell had set up as a general in the wars. You also had the Diggers from 1649, who pushed further, advocating communal land ownership and economic equality. They're small but symbolically powerful communities, such as St George's Hill, which is down my way in Surrey, directly challenged existing property relations. And these two groups in particular influenced writers such as Christopher Hill on how this sort of period was a sort of almost proto-Marxist adventure into how the state could be reconceptualized. And actually the religious element comes back as we move further. But did you have anything there, Jag?
No, I mean, I read Hill's book. I mean, when I read Hill's book, I was struck by, because he had this reputation for being a Marxist historian, but as we were talking about on the train not long ago, when I read the book, Turbulent Traditions and Factions, People, which is all about the different religious factions that during the interregnum and onwards. Oh, here you go.
There's also the century of revolution. So Jack and I were
I don't know
comparing
that one.
notes on our respective hill oeuvre.
Yes, very good.
But-
So in the one
Mm.
I read, the Marxist reading or analogy doesn't really come through so powerfully. It seemed to be more balanced. I mean, yeah, you have these debates, but doesn't have quite the same character or the same radical insistence that you might see in the 19th century debates.
Yeah, I know.
Maybe I misread it.
No, I completely agree. And well, Hill doesn't pose the broader revolution as this mark, but he certainly looks at groups like the Levellers and the Diggers as proto-Marxists. He sort of sees Cromwell and his ilk as part of what the Marxists would later describe as kind of your bourgeois revolution that has to come before the big socialist revolution. So in a sense, he was almost saying that these two, the Levellers and the Diggers, were the potential for full-on proletariat revolution, and that Cromwell and the army had led the bourgeois revolution, just as, say, in Russia, Kerensky had led the provisional government after the fall of the Tsarist regime, and then came the Bolsheviks, who then ousted the kind of liberal parties and created the proletarian revolution. For someone like Hill reading this, the Levellers and the Diggers were the potential Bolsheviks, if you sort of get the sort of comparison there in parallel.
Yeah, I can see it. And there were also the Anabaptists as well.
Yeah,
that was another, and I think the Latitudinarians, they came around at this time.
And
there were dozens.
Well, yeah, and these two groups, of course, as well, the Quakers, who emerged in the late 1640s, who rejected clerical and social hierarchy in favour of an inner light, undermining traditional forms of religious and political authority. And I'm quite interested in the Quakers because my family, on my mum and my granddad's side, going back, were of sort of Quaker background, and they focused on this idea of what you can do in the world to identify sort of God's work to try and put into action benefits for the community. That was education. They were also the people at the forefront of the abolition of slavery, these ideas of what can we do to better the human stock. On the flip side, you have these interesting ones who I only learned about recently when mentioning them in my thesis. The fifth monarchists, who fused, and you'll probably like this, Jack, fused apocalyptic theology with politics, believing that the collapse of monarchy heralded Christ's imminent rule and justifying radical republican action to basically maintain the republic, because you don't want another king to come back and it not be Christ. you want to maintain it until Christ comes. You don't want to kick out a king and think, because it's this whole millenarian tradition that Christ will return at some point, and well, we killed a king, so it must be now. So maintain the republic as long as you can until the one true king returns.
How interesting. I think I overlooked the fifth monarchist when I read Hill. Okay.
But they're an interesting sect. But the period saw an unprecedented explosion of print and participation. We saw this, as Jack and I have seen, with poets such as John Milton. And tens of thousands of pamphlets circulated, and discussions of this concept of license were at play. And political argument reached artisans, soldiers, and smallholders. Collectively, these movements show how civil war unleashed political imagination, generating ideas that existing institutions were unable or unwilling to absorb. This raises a central interpretive question. Were these radical movements symptoms of expanding liberty or signs of political and social disorder, chaos? Before I just ask Jack anything more, does anyone have any questions or comments? Stephanie or Jane, Oslem, Dar? Dara or anything?
No, there's nothing from my side.
Cool. Jack?
I think the expanding liberty is the same thing as the sign of political and social disorder, at least in this context.
Yeah.
I think it happened. I mean, it happened so fast.
Yeah, completely.
So fast. And but then also, it's there is a lot of dissent. So it's also political and social resistance. So it's also yeah, it's not yeah, maybe it's not liberty, but it's people fighting for it. So that's why it has the character of social disorder, but also social resistance. Yeah. But from a religious and theological perspective, the period is disastrous.
Yeah.
In my reading, the doctrines that are promulgated are very incoherent and not conducive to the salvation of souls, in my humble opinion.
I do find it interesting, again, riffing on something Dara raised last time. And Dara, I don't know if you would want to comment on this, but that whole divine right of kings concept, how well entrenched was it? Because obviously there's a certain passivity at this point, and not just a passivity, but the fact that there is this kind of rupture and massive emergence of ideas. How well entrenched had the divine right of kings concept been up until this point for there to suddenly be a complete dispersal of ideas? Now, you could take the sort of view that you're taking, Jack, which is that it was out of chaos and led to chaos. But it's interesting that there was such a sudden burst of intellectual sort of flourish when we're sort of led to believe that the divine right of kings had been this kind of prevailing viewpoint, both of the sovereign but also of his people. And to so quickly, as you say, do away with that and be like, well, we've got X idea in religion, we've got X idea when it comes to politics, that we want to make it egalitarian, like the Diggers. It sort of suggests that maybe people weren't too invested in the idea of the crown.
Well, it's a hard judgment to render because I mean, yes, printing is disseminating, but it's not necessarily, how representative it is of everyone. I mean, you know, I mean, it's going to be the people who can afford printing and the people who have the education to write stuff and think about it. They're probably going to be it's going to be the countrymen, you know, the landed people. You know, fine, but so those are the people who are most disposed to be in the political disagreement anyway, and to be thinking about why this thing called the divine right of king maybe isn't so good. If you were just sort of farming in Yorkshire, maybe you didn't really think so much of the divine right of kings thing until the war broke out, and and then I mean, in that context, it maybe makes sense why people might change their minds, but I think one of the things. Oh, sorry.
No, please, Jack.
I think that, I mean, there's a historian, what's his name? Ian Duffy. He writes a lot about the religious transformation in this period and also the Tudor period, and sort of the negative impact on the ordinary people. As it were, how they experienced their traditions and ways of life being uprooted in such small amount of time. And I don't know, maybe in the popular and folk world there is something like a suspicion of monarchy as well. That could be another thing. There's all kinds of things could be. I mean, especially in the North. I mean, they must remember the Northern revolts and the suppression of that by Henry. I don't know if that memory is erased by now.
And actually, maybe it's a uniquely English thing as well, because there is a lot of suspicion of power throughout, from Henry VIII through to now. You know, if we're even talking about the Reformation time, there's always a suspicion and a slight sort of laughter about political and religious power. I was only going to say that even if we were to try and argue that people weren't invested in the monarchist view of the world, it wasn't like people were massively invested in these more idealistic ones. The Diggers, as Billy Bragg, sort of punk folk songwriter, he has a song called "The World Turned Upside Down," and he says that ultimately from the men of property, the orders came. Who sent their hired men and troopers to wipe out the diggers' claim, tear down their cottages, destroy their corn. They were dispersed, but still their vision lingers on. So this idea that the Republican tradition still carried forward into a later age, into this idea that becomes known as the grand old cause of kind of pure republicanism. But ultimately, these kind of idealist movements are quelled. And who are they quelled by? They're quelled by the Cromwellian regime. So what is the Republican experiment? In 1649, to 1660, following the regicide, England entered its first and only sustained experiment in republican government, the Commonwealth. The monarchy and House of Lords were formally abolished, and sovereignty was claimed in the name of the people, represented by Parliament. In practice, however, the new regime depended heavily on the army, whose political authority had grown out of its decisive role in the wars. A sort of what we might now call like a junta, or a kind of, a very much a military dictatorship in some ways. Oliver Cromwell emerged as the dominant political figure of the 1650s, justifying strong executive power as necessary to secure godly reform, order and stability. Under the Protectorate from 1653, Cromwell ruled with quasi-monarchical authority, dissolving parliaments when they proved uncooperative and relying on military governance to maintain control. The central tension of the Republic lay between liberty and stability, how to preserve revolutionary principles without descending into chaos. There's a famous scene again in the film that I've referenced, Cromwell, where he's offered the crown and he says, "Why would I want this?" And he says, "Would you make a mere squire, so a very low down in the pecking order member of the aristocracy, a king? Why would you make me a king?" And he perhaps is reluctant to take the power, but ultimately he becomes what Richard Whatmore has termed a Caesar figure. Richard Whatmore, professor of intellectual history at St Andrews, terms a Caesar figure that at all revolutions, whether it be all the way back to Caesar himself, through to the modern revolutions of the Arab Springs, whether it's a bottom-up revolution or a military one, ultimately they all result in a Caesar figure, someone who ultimately says, well, we're in disarray, we've kicked out the old order, we need stability, we need someone to take charge. And that happens in every revolution, only with the exceptions of the chappie who returns to his plough, which is begins with C, Jack. The Emperor of Rome who returns to his plough.
Oh, Constantine.
No.
What do you mean?
I'm trying to remember now. It's the famous sort of example, because the modern example is, well, semi modern would be George Washington. That George Washington becomes president of America as a military leader, but returns to his plough. He doesn't suddenly decide that this revolution needs a Caesar figure. He returns to ordinary life. And
no, I'm not sure what the Roman equivalent of this is. I'd have to look it up. You don't mean Cato, surely?
No. I'm trying to think. Cincinnatus.
Oh, okay.
Who returns
I don't know
to
much
his
about
plough.
him.
And lays down authority. So he takes on the dictatum role and then lays down his authority again, because he doesn't believe that you should maintain sole, condensed, unitary authority for too long, other than in a crisis. But they're the only two examples where revolutions do not lead to permanent dictators, whether it be the Soviet Union, whether it be Nazi Germany, whether it be the French Revolution with Maximilien Robespierre, through to Napoleon, whether it be the English Civil War with the figure of Cromwell. All of these revolutions lead to ultimately Caesar figures. What happened in Iran? We got the Ayatollah, and this is another point where we can see these ideas in action today. But yeah, I think that's an important point to note. But the Republic and Cromwell, well, what are the historiographical interpretations? So let's go over some of the different viewpoints. The first one is the chap that we've mentioned a few times so far, Christopher Hill, a Marxist historian in quotation marks, I would say. Key works: The World Turned Upside Down, 1972, God's Englishman, Oliver Cromwell and the English Revolution in 1970, and the one that I have here, The Century of Revolution, 1603 to 1714. Hill interpreted the civil wars and the Cromwellian regime as a part of a bourgeois revolution, dismantling feudal and monarchical constraints. He treated radical groups, as we've discussed, the Levellers, Diggers, Fifth Monarchists, as serious ideological actors, and Cromwell as a revolutionary shaped by deep social divides and different sort of political influences. Now, we turn to the work of a professor of the university that this project is associated with, Professor John Adamson, who's the head of the humanities department. His key works, The Noble Revolt of 2007, the essays on the politics of the 1640s and Cromwell's circle, Adamson emphasises elite politics, faction and contingency, arguing that many parliamentarians sought reform rather than revolution. For him, Cromwell appears as a reluctant ruler driven by crisis management rather than Republican conviction. And there's a picture of Professor Adamson's book there. But much less on this idea that he was being shaped, that Cromwell was being shaped by these kind of different ideological elements that he was seeing emerge at the time, as you know, as Hill is looking at the Levellers, the Diggers, and that it was kind of a overthrow of the old regime, but much more that it was court politics, that it was Cromwell engaging. Well, Cromwell basically almost sort of choosing his moment because other political actors within the period had opened up the space for him to eventually kind of take charge of the Republic. But there are other opinions as well to these two diametrically opposed ones. You've got the revisionist and post-revisionist perspectives. Conrad Russell, The Causes of the English Civil War, stressed short-term political breakdown, mistrust and miscalculation rather than ideological inevitability. Basically that Charles I was too blunt, too adamant on his kind of perfect rule, and that if it had been anyone but Charles, maybe the monarchy could have continued. You've got Kishlansky, The Rise of the New Model Army, who downplays popular radicalism but highlights discipline, order, and institutional conservatism. The military junta, a kind of traditionalist grouping who then ultimately want to take charge and restore stability to the nation. And then John Morrill, The Nature of the English Revolution, presents the war as a war of religion as much as a political revolution shaped by local experience. So this is the point that Jack was raising, that there's massive fracturing amongst different groups and religious sects at this time, and that was the kind of core element to this period. But what about republicanism reconsidered? Well, Blair Worden, again, a cornerstone of thinking on this period. The Rump Parliament, 1974, God's Instruments, 2012, portrays the Republic as fragile and ideologically conflicted, with Cromwell torn between godly rule and political necessity. So the idea of making this kind of world that's a virtuous kind of, as Jack has discussed before, sort of this idea of Cicero and the virtuous republic and restoring this kind of ancient ideal of republicanism, conflicted with kind of godly rule and political necessity, right? So the practical day-to-days of running a country against your moral ideals. So what are these fault lines in the historiography? Well, Cromwell was a revolutionary agent of structural change, according to Hill, this kind of very revolutionary figure, or a conservative crisis manager presiding over unintended outcomes, Adamson and maybe Russell. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on what they've heard there, and when you put that into perspective of what we've read so far. Jack?
Yeah, it's good to get these different perspectives, and yeah, because you can see why some of them might give certain angles over others, like the institutional conservatism thing of Kishlansky is quite interesting. I don't think moral rights, the wars of religion thing seems a bit contrived, but I'm not ready to work. So yeah, in terms of Cromwell's identity, hard to say. Based on what you presented, I think I probably err more on the side of Adamson on this. But indeed, it doesn't mean that he doesn't have that capacity, that spirit in him. I mean, he ends up being quite a radical instrument of, I think, of change and of a very, very harsh governance.
Jack, you are phenomenal. England. You're phenomenal because you have brought another beautiful segue Here we are. Oliver Cromwell, in the name of God go, speech dismissing the Rump Parliament. Now, I'm going to try and emulate my greatest Richard Harris Cromwell movie voice to give this, because I like to get passionate.
If I can interrupt before you begin, Sam, I unfortunately have to log off
oh, do you?
imminently. So I will say my goodbyes now, but encourage you all to stay on the call and to engage with this text. I'll read it later. It looks quite interesting.
Excellent. Thank you,
but
Jack.
I wish you all a good discussion. Good night.
Fantastic.
And
thank you, Jack.
It's been really great.
So, in the name of God go. It is high time for me to put an end to your sitting in this place, which you have dishonoured by your contempt of all virtue, and defiled by your practice of every vice. Ye are a factious crew, and enemies to all good government. Ye are a pack of mercenary wretches, and would like to sell your country for a mess of pottage, and like Judas betray your country for a few pieces of money. Is there a single virtue now remaining amongst you? Is there one vice you do not possess? Ye have no more religion than my horse. Gold is your God. Which of you have not bartered your conscience for bribes? Is there a man amongst you that has the least care for the good of the commonwealth? Ye sordid prostitutes, have you not defiled this sacred place, and turned the Lord's temple into a den of thieves? By your immoral principles and wicked practices, ye are grown intolerably odious to the whole nation. You were deputed here by the people to get grievances redressed, are yourselves become the greatest grievance. Your country therefore calls upon me to cleanse the Augean stable by putting a final period to your iniquitous proceedings in this house, and which by God's help and the strength he has given me, I am now come to do. I command you, therefore, upon the peril of your lives, to depart immediately out of this place. Go, get you out, make haste, ye venal slaves, be gone. So take away that shining bauble there, and lock up the doors. In the name of God, go. So Cromwell there, I hope, beautifully reflected in my soliloquy, telling the Rump Parliament that their time is up, that they have no need to stay any longer to deliberate on policy, and that ultimately they have failed in their duty as deputies of the people. He's calling on God, he's calling on virtue, he's calling on a lot of the things that we've discussed in this episode and previous episodes in this series, about what is it to be a virtuous citizen, what is it to be a virtuous politician. And he's obviously drawing on these biblical analogies, the Lord's temple, defiling it, taking money, their passing of coin, all of these things are scriptural. And what we can see here is ultimately the turning point in the Republic that is turning towards dictatorship, that Cromwell is dismissing these people and saying, you have no service, you have no purpose. He refers to the bauble being the mace that sits in the central part of the House of Commons. So if the Commons is sitting, it has to have the mace in place at the centre of the Commons in front of the Speaker. He's saying, dismiss this bauble. And in the film, he chucks the bauble across the floor as if to kind of say, the whole concept of this place is irrelevant now. And yeah, essentially he's saying there is no need for a parliament anymore. And he wants his new model army to take these parliamentarians away, not to kill them, not to execute them, but to say your position is worthless. You have failed in your conviction to this republic that we have established, that the republic is supposed to be this virtuous Roman republic that we're supposed to be bringing to England, and you really do not represent this. So away with you. And this tract, this massive influential turning point in the way that politics is thought about in the UK, and perhaps at its most sort of worrying, most sort of the potential turn towards dictatorship, has been repeated many times. And Dara, I wouldn't be surprised if you've heard that final line in the last few years, and maybe some of the rest of you have. But in the name of God, go. That was if you remember, Dar, said about Boris Johnson by David Davis, the old Brexit secretary. He repeated
There was
this.
somebody else who said it recently as well. I
Mm.
think it was doing. I think David Cameron once said it to Jeremy Corbyn, actually.
Yes, he did.
When Jeremy Corbyn was going through his own leadership issues.
And during Margaret Thatcher's downfall, it was also used.
Yes, yeah.
As well.
So politicians do like to use it, in fairness.
As if you have run your course. There is no more service that you can give now. He's not denying that parliamentary democracy is a good system, but he's saying you have failed now. This is the point at which you can go no further. So Cromwell is doubting the republican system in the situation that it's in 1653. And yeah, we've seen it many times, and who knows, maybe we'll see it again with the tumult of British politics in the coming days. We never know, but I think it's quite a poignant line to get to the conclusion of this topic on. So shoot for the stars. You might end up among scientists. Well, next time, in 2 weeks, we will be looking at the thought and work of Copernicus, the scientific revolution. Scientific advancement under Cromwell's Commonwealth, despite the political turmoil, the 1650s saw significant state-supported interest in science and technology for economic and social benefits. And I would also like to add something that we haven't discussed because we've been discussing the politics, but something to note is that the Navy and the Army are massively transformed during this period. The reason is ultimately that Britain becomes a global player in the way that it does, and obviously the dominant global player in centuries to come, is due to the reforms made in the Army and the Navy during this period. The Navy becomes the world's leading seaborne fleet, seaborne force, and fights. Interestingly, the Republican forces fight privateers in the Caribbean because obviously under Elizabeth, there's already in the previous century, in the 1500s, under Queen Elizabeth I, there is already colonialism. There's already occupation of sugar islands in the Caribbean. But interestingly, the monarchist forces that were maintaining the sugar islands become privateers fighting Republican forces of the British state in the sugar islands. So there's these unique conflicts. And in fact, conflict persisted until very, very recently. The Scilly Islands only finished declaring war on the rest of England in the 1990s because they had been the last bastion of monarchist tendencies. So the longest war in human history was fought between the Scilly Islands off of Cornwall and the rest of the English state. Because they never signed off the peace agreement. But to get back to my beautiful segue, scientific advancement, we see this under the Commonwealth. Dr. John Wilkins was a leading figure during this period in the 17th century scientific movement and brother-in-law to Oliver Cromwell. He was heavily influenced by the ideas of Copernicus and the idea of a universe with other possibly habitable worlds. Amazingly, Wilkins famously designed a flying chariot in the 1640s based on the idea of travelling to the moon, inspired by the new astronomy. Return in 2 weeks for our discussion of Copernicus. And yeah, I'd like to thank you all very much for being here. And please feel free to ask any questions, any final comments. But otherwise, we will see you in 2 weeks' time, hopefully in person.
Yes, that would be good.
Wonderful.
Of course, I'd like to know whether all of this influenced France.
Oh, I mean, very much so, in the sense of the idea that you could obviously execute a king, that people like Rousseau were looking at England and thinking, well, they've tried out this kind of idealist Republican project. Interestingly, I don't know how well versed he would have been in it, and I've never seen any mention in his work of diggers or levelers, because I guess their influence was so small at the time that you wouldn't have had a kind of a particularly solid record of them when Rousseau visited England. But I think he would have been very much endeared by the levelers prospect of this kind of natural harmony that they wanted to establish in England. But yeah, certainly French revolutionary figures were looking at the Republic and the English Republic and thinking, well, how did the English do it? How can we try and differ from it? And how can we try and establish, obviously, the Republic from the French Revolution? In terms of
that's quite a jump in time from the 1650s to that's about 100 years later, isn't it?
Oh, very much so. And this is the thing. This is why it's difficult to probably trace direct influences. But what you do have is you have people making records of the English Revolution, like Rapin, who I look at, writing histories of England for French readers, because he's trying to get them to look at the absolutism of the monarchy in France, and the reason that he'd been exiled from France, and he's writing for French readers. So they are getting the idea of what has happened in England, and trying to put it across in French. I think there probably would. They're probably, the only thing I'd say is there's probably an awareness that it failed. So how far, if you look at those who were influenced by the English Revolution, Marx was massively influenced by the English Revolution and really does kind of take an interest in it. In terms of the French Revolution, well, the French Revolution is obviously influenced by factors such as the American Revolution much more than it is influenced by the English Revolution. So that sort of overshadows, almost blots out the kind of English influence, but I'm sure it's there.
What's the name of the man you're researching?
Rapin de Thoyras, Rapindethoyras, a Huguenot refugee living in England.
Okay.
And other figures like Montesquieu, and I'm sure we'll look at it. But I think the fact that you have the American Revolution so soon before the French Revolution means that, obviously, revolting against England, you can't really then tie in an English Revolution when you're focusing on an American Revolution against the English, if you see what I mean. So I imagine there's an element of kind of like, well, we're aware of it, but we'll add it in when it's useful rather than necessarily focusing on it, because we're focusing on the revolution that split from England, sort of thing. But it's the same thing in English history as well. I mean, the English Civil War became very popular in the 20th century, but prior to that, the English Civil War was looked at very much as a point of rupture rather than as a point of sort of like political evolution, because the Glorious Revolution, as I was saying to Jack earlier, that maybe we could mention at the end, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 sort of is seen as much more important to the evolution of the British state than the Civil War. The idea that was the point at which monarchy and parliament were synthesized in a way that didn't allow either too much authority, that there were still checks and balances on both remits of political power within the English state. So the English Civil War and that revolution became a little bit sort of lesser and more of an aberration, rather than the Glorious Revolution that was seen as sort of restoring this ancient English liberty that was threatened by both republicanism and by unbridled monarchy that came with the Restoration in 1660. And yeah, one thing I don't think we mentioned really in our discussion too much was the, as we see here in the Republican experiment, the son, Richard Cromwell, proved unable to command either the army or parliament. So Richard, basically, Cromwell's son, tried to maintain this idea of the Republic, but obviously the fact that he was a hereditary appointment displeased many Republican elements who were thinking, well, why has Cromwell allowed his son to become the leader of the Republic? This really isn't right, because we've kicked out a king on the basis that it's not the way to rule, and now Cromwell is acting like a king. So by the end, there was a lot of displeasure, and Richard Cromwell ultimately lasts for those mere 2 years, flees to France, and ends up he lives a very long time apparently in I don't know so much about this, but in a lot of kind of continental 17th century writing, there's mentions of Richard Cromwell being at various courts around Europe. So he sort of lives an exceedingly long time and is just sort of going around different cities of Europe, participating in various political discussions. But yeah, he ultimately fails as well. But yeah, I hope that somewhat answers the question. But
Yes,
it's certainly there, but much more in later revolutionary politics that looks towards what Hill discusses in terms of these kind of radical elements. Yeah. Any other questions at all? Well, if not, I think we will say goodbye, and we shall look forward to a session on scientific revolution in 2 weeks' time. But thank you very much indeed for everyone for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye. See you
Bye.
soon.
See you then,
Bye.
Stephanie. Thank you very much. Bye all. Bye.